An entire class of young students with disabilities mysteriously vanished during a field trip to Everglades National Park. But 48 hours later, a park ranger finds something shocking deep in the swamp, a discovery that reveals the terrifying reality of what happened to the children and who was responsible for their disappearance. Sarah Miller stared at the growing collection of coffee cups littering the small conference room table, each one marking another hour without her son. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that accentuated the dark circles under her eyes. 48 hours. Ethan had been missing for 48 hours now, and every minute felt like an eternity. Her husband Mark sat beside her, his shoulders hunched forward as if carrying a physical weight. His normally immaculate appearance had deteriorated. Stubble darkened his jaw, and his rumpled shirt told the story of 2 sleepless nights spent at the station. "Mr. and Mrs. Miller," Detective Garcia said as she entered the room, a fresh stack of papers in her hands. "I know this has been unimaginably difficult, but I want to update you on where we stand." Sarah straightened in her chair, desperate for any news about her 10-year-old son. Ethan was special in every way, not just because he was her child, but because he required special care due to his developmental disabilities. He wore thick glasses that were constantly sliding down his nose, and that morning, the last time she'd seen him, he'd insisted on wearing his favorite orange shirt for the field trip. "Despite mobilizing every available officer and search team in 3 counties, we haven't found any concrete leads yet," Detective Garcia continued, her voice professional but tinged with frustration. "We've been conducting aerial searches. Ground teams are combing every inch of the park, and we've set up checkpoints on all major roads within a 100-mile radius." Mark's hand found Sarah's under the table, squeezing tightly. "How is this possible?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "An entire bus of children doesn't just disappear without a trace?" Detective Garcia nodded toward the whiteboard across the room. 10 children's faces smiled back at them, school photos taken months ago, innocent and unaware of what was to come. Alongside them were photos of Ms. Johnson and Ms. Torres, the 2 female teachers who had accompanied the class on the trip. 12 people had vanished without a trace, and Mr. Wilson, the male teacher, was the only one who made it back. "That's what makes this case so unusual," Detective Garcia admitted. "Let me walk you through the timeline again, just to make sure we haven't missed anything." Sarah's eyes fixed on Ethan's photo as the detective spoke. His crooked smile, those oversized glasses, the cowlick in his hair that never stayed down no matter how much she tried to tame it. The special needs class from Oak Ridge Private Academy left the main visitor center of Everglades National Park at precisely 9:30 a.m. on Wednesday morning, Detective Garcia recited. They boarded a park-owned tour bus with an experienced park employee driving. Mr. Wilson, the male teacher who also works with the class, remained at the visitor center due to limited seating capacity on the bus. "He should have gone instead of one of the other teachers," Sarah interjected, her voice brittle with exhaustion and accusation. "He's stronger. He could have protected them." Detective Garcia continued gently. The bus was scheduled to return after a 3-hour educational tour of the accessible sections of the park. When they didn't return by 12:45 p.m., park staff began radio attempts to contact the driver. After receiving no response for 30 minutes, they dispatched rangers to search the designated tour route. Mark rubbed his face with his free hand and found nothing. "Nothing on the route," Detective Garcia confirmed. "No signs of an accident, no tire marks indicating the bus went off-road. The bus simply wasn't there." Sarah stared at the timeline written on the whiteboard in Detective Garcia's neat handwriting. Each entry marked another moment when her son was slipping further away from her. "If this is a kidnapping, why haven't we received ransom demands?" Sarah asked, the question that had been haunting her since the first hours of the disappearance. "Isn't that how these things usually work?" Detective Garcia nodded. "Typically, yes. In most kidnapping cases, perpetrators make contact within 24 hours to capitalize on the initial panic and emotional distress of the families. The fact that we haven't received any demands is unusual. The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. If the kidnappers weren't asking for money, what did they want with 10 disabled children? "We've questioned Mr. Wilson extensively," Detective Garcia continued. "Initially, he was our primary person of interest simply because he was the only adult from the school who wasn't on the bus. However, his alibi is airtight. Security footage from the visitor center shows him remaining on the premises the entire time. Multiple witnesses have confirmed he was visibly distraught when the bus didn't return, pacing anxiously and making repeated calls to both teachers' cell phones. Sarah remembered Mr. Wilson from parent-teacher conferences, a kind man in his 40s who had dedicated his career to special education. The thought that he could be involved had never crossed her mind. "We located the tour bus late last night," Detective Garcia said, her tone shifting. Sarah gasped, hope surging through her exhausted body. "And the children?" Detective Garcia's expression told her everything before the words came. The bus was empty. It had been driven approximately 7 miles off the main tour route and partially concealed in a remote area. Our forensics team has been processing it since discovery, and so far we've found no signs of violence or struggle on board. "What does that mean?" Mark asked. "It suggests the children and teachers may have exited the bus voluntarily," Detective Garcia explained, "or they were coerced in a way that didn't result in physical resistance. 10 special needs children wouldn't just calmly walk off a bus in the middle of nowhere," Sarah protested. "Ethan gets anxious in unfamiliar places. Several of the children are nonverbal. At least 3 use wheelchairs full-time." Detective Garcia nodded. "Which is why we believe multiple perpetrators must be involved. This was a carefully planned operation." She walked to the whiteboard and tapped the driver's photo. The park employee driving the bus, Carlos Mendez, has been with the Park Service for 12 years with an impeccable record. We're investigating his background more thoroughly, but at this point, we have to consider the possibility he was either coerced or is involved. "What about connections between the families?" Mark asked. "Could this be targeted at one specific child, with the others taken as collateral?" "We've been interviewing all the families extensively," Detective Garcia confirmed, "looking for any connections, threats, unusual financial activity, anything that might provide a motive. So far, nothing concrete has emerged." Sarah's gaze drifted back to the photos of the children. Each face was familiar to her from school events and playdates at their home. Ethan had struggled to make friends all his life, but in this class he had found true acceptance among peers who understood difference in a way most adults never could. "Perhaps the special needs aspect itself is significant," Mark suggested, his analytical mind still functioning despite his exhaustion. "Oak Ridge Academy's program is exclusive. Tuition runs nearly $40,000 a year. Every family represented here has financial means." Detective Garcia nodded slowly. "That's currently our working theory. The family's collective wealth makes them potential targets for a ransom situation. But without contact from the kidnappers, we're still operating on speculation." Sarah's head throbbed as she tried to maintain her composure. The thought of Ethan somewhere in the vast Everglades, scared and confused without his routine, his medication, or his parents, was unbearable. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "In 4 hours at first light, we'll begin a comprehensive grid search of the surrounding wetlands," Detective Garcia explained. "We've called in additional volunteers from neighboring counties, airboats, drones with thermal imaging, and search dogs trained specifically for finding people in swamp conditions. If they're still in the park, we will find them." The if echoed in Sarah's mind. If they were still in the park. If they were still alive. If. "Get some rest if you can," Detective Garcia advised gently. "There are cots set up in the break room. We'll wake you immediately if there's any news." Sarah knew she wouldn't sleep, not while Ethan was out there, confused and frightened, wondering why his mother hadn't come to save him yet. The door burst open without warning, causing Sarah to jolt upright from her hunched position. A uniformed officer stood in the doorway, breathing heavily as if he'd run through the station. "Detective Garcia," he said urgently, completely ignoring protocol. "We've got something. Park ranger conducting a preliminary sector search discovered multiple wheelchairs dumped in a remote section of the Everglades." Sarah felt the room tilt slightly. "Wheelchairs?" she repeated, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. The officer's eyes darted to her briefly before returning to Detective Garcia. His hesitation told Sarah everything she needed to know. "And bodies," he said finally, his voice dropping. "2 bodies, ma'am." The floor seemed to drop out from beneath Sarah. Mark's arm immediately went around her shoulders, steadying her. "Are they—" She couldn't finish the question. Detective Garcia was already on her feet, gathering her jacket and radio. "We don't have identifications yet," she said firmly. "Let's not jump to conclusions. I need to get to the scene immediately." "We're coming with you," Mark stated, his tone leaving no room for argument as he helped Sarah to her feet. Detective Garcia shook her head. "This is an active crime scene. I can't allow—" "That's our son out there," Sarah interrupted, suddenly finding her voice. "Either you take us with you, or we'll follow you anyway." Several tense seconds passed before Detective Garcia nodded. "You can follow in your vehicle, but you'll need to remain at a distance from the actual scene. I mean it. You cannot compromise this investigation." Within minutes, a caravan of police vehicles was speeding through the early morning darkness, lights flashing but sirens silent. Sarah and Mark followed in their SUV, the silence between them filled with unspoken terror. Sarah's hand found Mark's on the center console, gripping it with white-knuckled intensity. "It might not be him," Mark said finally, his voice cracking. "We can't assume the worst." Sarah nodded mechanically, but her mind was already racing through worst-case scenarios. Ethan didn't use a wheelchair full-time like some of his classmates, but he sometimes needed one for longer excursions when his balance issues and fatigue became too much. The caravan turned onto an unmarked dirt road that eventually gave way to a crude path barely wide enough for vehicles. Eventually, they reached a point where even the police SUVs could go no further, and they continued on foot. Mark helped Sarah navigate the increasingly muddy terrain as they followed a line of officers through the dense vegetation. The scene unfolded before them as they emerged into a small clearing. Multiple police vehicles had already arrived, their lights casting eerie blue and red patterns across the swamp water. Forensic technicians in white protective suits moved carefully through the area, placing evidence markers and taking photographs. Several uniformed officers maintained a perimeter with yellow crime scene tape. And there, partially submerged in the shallow, murky water, were the wheelchairs. Sarah counted 7 of them, scattered in a rough semicircle. Their colorful frames, pink, blue, green, and purple, stood in stark contrast to the browns and greens of the swamp. Some had clearly been damaged, with bent wheels and broken footrests. Detective Garcia intercepted them before they could get closer. "This is as far as you go," she said firmly, placing a hand on Mark's shoulder. Sarah peered past her, scanning the scene desperately. "The bodies?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Detective Garcia's expression softened slightly. "They've already been placed in body bags and are being prepared for transport to the medical examiner's office." Sarah watched as 2 black body bags on stretchers were being carefully carried through the difficult terrain toward the waiting medical examiner's van. One was noticeably smaller than the other. A commotion broke out near the perimeter as another couple pushed past the officers. Sarah recognized them immediately. David and Elizabeth Jacobson, parents of Sophie, a 9-year-old girl with cerebral palsy who was one of Ethan's classmates. "That's Sophie's backpack," Elizabeth screamed, pointing toward a purple backpack with butterfly patches sitting on a tarp with other collected evidence. "That's my daughter's backpack." David Jacobson crumpled to his knees in the mud, a primal sound of grief escaping his throat as officers tried to restrain Elizabeth from crossing into the crime scene. Detective Garcia immediately moved toward them, signaling to her officers to bring the Jacobsons to a more private area away from the active scene. Sarah watched, frozen in place, as the detective spoke quietly to the couple, her hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. When she returned to the Millers, her face was grave. "I'm sorry you had to witness that. We've made a preliminary identification of one of the victims as Sophie Jacobson based on personal effects and physical description. The other appears to be Ms. Johnson, one of the teachers." Sarah felt a conflicting wave of emotions, devastating sadness for Sophie and her family, and a shameful relief that it wasn't Ethan. The guilt of that relief hit her immediately, making her nauseous. "How did they—" Mark couldn't finish the question. Detective Garcia glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "The forensic team reports both victims show signs of execution-style gunshot wounds to the head. This wasn't an accident or exposure to the elements. It was deliberate." Sarah swayed slightly, and Mark tightened his grip around her waist. "The wheelchairs appear to have been intentionally damaged," Detective Garcia continued. "This suggests the perpetrators no longer needed them after selecting which victims to keep." The implication was clear. The remaining children were likely still alive, at least for now. "Something's not right about this scene," Sarah said suddenly, her eyes fixed on the wheelchairs. "Look at how they're arranged. They're not just dumped randomly. They're positioned almost deliberately, in a semicircle." Detective Garcia followed her gaze, tilting her head slightly as she considered the pattern. "You're right. This appears staged, like they wanted these chairs to be found." "But why?" Mark asked. "If they're trying to hide their tracks, why create such an obvious scene?" "It could be a message," Detective Garcia speculated, "or a distraction." A man in a medical examiner's jacket approached, nodding respectfully to the Millers before addressing Detective Garcia. "Preliminary time of death estimate puts both victims at approximately 10 to 12 hours ago. They were alive for at least a day after the initial kidnapping." Sarah's mind raced with the implications. If Sophie and Ms. Johnson had been alive until roughly 10 hours ago, that meant the other children, including Ethan, might still be alive. "We need to expand the search," she said urgently. "If they killed these two here, the others might be nearby." "We're already coordinating a wider search pattern," Detective Garcia assured her. "Every available resource is being deployed. Air support will arrive at daybreak for aerial thermal imaging." Mark pulled Sarah closer as they watched the grim work continue around them. The first faint light of dawn was beginning to illuminate the swamp, revealing the full scope of the crime scene. In the distance, they could hear more vehicles arriving, more officers joining the search. "He's still alive," Sarah whispered, more to herself than to Mark. "I would know if he wasn't. I would feel it." Mark nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon as the sun began to rise over the Everglades, casting long shadows across the water where the empty wheelchairs stood as silent witnesses to unimaginable cruelty. By mid-morning, the remote crime scene had transformed into a circus of activity. News helicopters circled overhead like vultures, their distant rotors a constant soundtrack to the unfolding tragedy. At the main park entrance, a fleet of media vans with satellite dishes extended skyward crowded the visitor parking lot, reporters broadcasting live updates as law enforcement vehicles continued to arrive. The story had exploded across national news networks with the sensational headline, "Disabled Children Kidnapped, 2 Found Dead in Florida Everglades." Every major network had dispatched teams to cover what was quickly becoming one of the most shocking crimes in recent memory. The FBI had officially taken jurisdiction of the case, setting up a command center in the park's main visitor building. Special Agent Daniels, a stern woman in her 40s with short cropped hair and a perpetually furrowed brow, had been appointed lead investigator. She stood before a hastily arranged podium at the media staging area, flanked by local law enforcement and park officials. At approximately 5:42 this morning, search teams discovered the remains of 2 individuals connected to the Oak Ridge Academy disappearance, Agent Daniels stated, her voice clipped and professional. We can confirm that one victim has been identified as Sophie Jacobson, age 9, and the other as Katherine Johnson, age 34, a teacher at the academy. Due to the ongoing nature of this investigation and out of respect for the families, we will not be sharing details about the condition of the remains or cause of death at this time. Reporters shouted questions simultaneously, creating a cacophony of voices. Is this being investigated as a terrorist incident? Were ransom demands made before the killings? Are there suspects in custody? What about the other children? Are they believed to be alive? Agent Daniels raised her hand for silence. We are pursuing multiple leads and utilizing every resource available to locate the remaining children and teacher. We ask anyone with information, no matter how insignificant it might seem, to contact the FBI tip line immediately. We have reason to believe. A police communications officer approached the podium hurriedly, interrupting by handing Agent Daniels a folded note. The agent read it quickly, her expression unchanging save for a slight tightening around her eyes. This press conference is concluded. We will provide updates as the investigation progresses. Thank you. Ignoring the renewed barrage of questions, Agent Daniels strode quickly back toward the visitor center, where the Millers and other parents of the missing children had gathered in a private room, anxiously awaiting news. When Agent Daniels entered, the room fell instantly silent. 8 sets of parents sat in uncomfortable chairs arranged in a loose circle, some holding hands, others sitting in isolated bubbles of grief. The Jacobsons were noticeably absent, having been taken to a separate location to formally identify their daughter and begin the devastating process of making arrangements. We've received a ransom demand, Agent Daniels announced without preamble, her direct approach a stark contrast to Detective Garcia's more empathetic style. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The demand came via email approximately 15 minutes ago, sent to the school administrator's official address, Agent Daniels continued. The message demands $2 million in cash within 24 hours for the safe return of the remaining children and Ms. Reyes. Let me see it, demanded James Whitaker, father of twins, Ryan and Tyler, both missing. A successful investment banker, he had been increasingly combative with authorities as the hours passed without progress. Agent Daniels hesitated, then turned a tablet to face the parents. The email was displayed on screen, its clinical language at odds with the horror it contained. We have your children, Sophie Jacobson and Katherine Johnson, were eliminated to demonstrate our resolve. The remaining hostages will be released upon receipt of $2 million in unmarked bills. You have 24 hours. Further instructions will follow confirmation of your agreement to these terms. Each 12-hour period without compliance will result in another elimination. The wealthy families of Oak Ridge Academy can certainly afford this small price for their children's lives. Below the text was a photo showing the 8 remaining children and Ms. Reyes huddled together in what appeared to be a dimly lit room with concrete walls. They were sitting on the floor, some leaning against each other for support. Though the image was slightly blurry, Sarah immediately spotted Ethan in his orange shirt, his glasses missing and his face tear-streaked but undeniably alive. "Ethan," she whispered, reaching toward the screen before pulling her hand back. He looked terrified, but physically unharmed from what she could tell. "The timing of this demand is significant," Agent Daniels said. "It came immediately after news of the discovered bodies reached the media. The perpetrators were clearly waiting for public confirmation of the killings to maximize the psychological impact of their demand." "Do they think we won't pay?" Rebecca Chen asked incredulously. Her daughter Lily, who had Down syndrome, was barely visible in the corner of the ransom photo. "I'll sell my house today if I have to." The email also contained an appendix with specific information about each family's financial status, Agent Daniels continued. stock portfolios, real estate holdings, business valuations, details that aren't readily available through simple internet searches. This suggests inside knowledge or extensive research. Several parents immediately volunteered to contribute their portion of the ransom. The Whitakers offered to cover half the amount themselves. Others began making calls to banks and financial advisors, desperate to liquidate assets immediately. Agent Daniels raised her hand for silence. "I need to be clear about the FBI's position here. We have a strict policy against ransom payments in kidnapping cases." "That's your child in that photo," James Whitaker snapped, pointing at Sarah and Mark. "What's your policy on that?" "Mr. Whitaker, I understand your frustration," Agent Daniels replied evenly. "But decades of experience have shown that paying ransoms encourages more kidnappings and rarely results in the safe return of victims. Once the money is received, kidnappers have little incentive to keep witnesses alive." "So what are you saying?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "That we just leave them there? Hope you find them before the 12-hour deadline?" "We are deploying every resource available to locate your children," Agent Daniels assured her. "We have technical specialists tracing the email origin, cryptocurrency experts monitoring potential ransom accounts, and tactical teams prepared to execute immediate rescue operations once we have a location." "And if you don't find them in time?" Mark asked quietly. Agent Daniels' silence was answer enough. "We need to buy time," she finally said. "We're preparing a public statement that we will not negotiate with kidnappers. This is standard procedure designed to stall while our teams work to locate the children." "You're using our children as bait," Rebecca Chen said, her voice hollow. "We're trying to save them," Agent Daniels corrected firmly. "Every decision we make is with that singular goal in mind." The statement was broadcast on all major networks within the hour, a stern-faced Agent Daniels declaring that the United States does not negotiate with kidnappers and that those responsible will be brought to justice with the full force of federal law. Sarah watched the broadcast on a small television in the visitor center break room, horror growing in the pit of her stomach. "They're going to kill another child," she whispered to Mark. "They're going to think we're not taking them seriously." Before Mark could respond, Agent Daniels entered the room with Detective Garcia. "We have a working theory about the kidnapping," Agent Daniels announced. "Based on the detailed financial information in the ransom note and the specific targeting of this class, we believe someone with inside knowledge of the school and families is involved." "Mr. Wilson?" Sarah asked, thinking of the male teacher who had stayed behind. Detective Garcia shook her head. "Actually, we've placed Mr. Wilson under protective custody rather than surveillance. If our theory is correct, he may be a witness rather than a suspect. The fact that he didn't go on the trip might not have been coincidence. He may have been deliberately excluded from the plan." "Then who?" Mark asked. "We're investigating all staff with access to student records and financial aid applications," Agent Daniels explained. "The school requires detailed financial disclosures for their scholarship program, even for families who don't apply for aid. Someone with access to those records would know exactly which families had the means to pay substantial ransoms." Sarah felt the walls closing in around her as the reality of their situation became clearer. Someone had looked at her son, at all these children, and seen only dollar signs. Someone had calculated exactly how much fear and grief would drive parents to empty their bank accounts without question. And worst of all, with the FBI's public refusal to pay, that same someone was now deciding which child would die next. Exhaustion and desperation drove Sarah to return home briefly that afternoon. Mark insisted on staying at the command center, unwilling to miss any developments in the search. Their sprawling Mediterranean-style home in Coral Gables, normally a haven of comfort, felt cavernous and empty without Ethan's presence. She made her way to Ethan's bedroom, the dinosaur decals on the door, a poignant reminder of his recent obsession with paleontology. Inside, everything remained exactly as he'd left it. Bed unmade, despite her reminders that morning. A half-completed Lego structure on his desk. Favorite books, stacked haphazardly on the nightstand. Sarah opened his medication drawer, collecting the specialized anti-seizure drugs he needed daily. The unmarked pill organizer wouldn't be helpful to whoever had him. They wouldn't know which medications to give when or how to manage his dosage if he had a breakthrough seizure. The thought of Ethan suffering without proper medical care intensified her already overwhelming anxiety. As she placed the medications in her purse, her cell phone rang. The screen displayed unknown number, something she would normally ignore, but nothing was normal anymore. "Hello?" she answered, her heart pounding. "Is this Sarah Miller, mother of Ethan?" The voice was digitally altered, impossible to identify as male or female, its mechanical tone sending chills down her spine. "Yes," she whispered, immediately reaching for the recording device the FBI had given all the parents in case of contact. "Who is this?" "That doesn't matter," the voice replied. "What matters is that your son needs his medication. He's missed 2 doses already." Sarah froze. They knew about Ethan's medication schedule. "Since the FBI has announced they won't pay our collective demand, we're offering individual arrangements," the voice continued. $500,000 for your son's safe return. Just yours, not the others. You bring the money, you get Ethan back. Simple transaction. "I need to talk to him," Sarah insisted, trying to keep her voice steady as she activated the recording. "I need to know he's alive." "Check your text messages in 2 minutes," the voice instructed. "You'll have your proof of life then. Meanwhile, understand something clearly. If you involve the police or FBI, Ethan dies immediately. This offer expires in 3 hours. After that, we move on to parents who value their children more." The call disconnected abruptly, leaving Sarah standing in Ethan's room, trembling. Her first instinct was to call Mark, then the FBI, but the kidnapper's threat echoed in her mind. What if they were watching the command center? What if they knew which parents were cooperating with authorities? She paced the room, clutching her phone, waiting for the promised text message. When it arrived, she nearly dropped the phone in her haste to open it. The photo showed Ethan holding today's Miami Herald, his face pale and frightened, but unmistakably alive. His glasses were askew, and he looked directly at the camera with red-rimmed eyes. They'd made him change clothes. He now wore a plain gray T-shirt instead of his orange one. A digital timestamp in the corner showed the photo was taken less than 30 minutes ago. Another text quickly followed with coordinates and instructions. $500,000 cash. Come alone. 1 hour. No police asterisk. Sarah's mind raced. The FBI had been clear about their policy against ransom payments, but this wasn't their child. The kidnappers knew exactly what they were doing by contacting parents individually, playing on their desperation, their willingness to do anything to save their own child, even at the expense of others. She rushed to their home office and opened the safe behind Mark's degrees on the wall. Inside was emergency cash, nowhere near enough, and their important documents. She grabbed the cash, approximately $3,000, then ran to her jewelry box. Her engagement ring, a 3-carat diamond that Mark had spent months saving for before they were married. Diamond stud earrings from her 30th birthday. A Tiffany bracelet from her mother. A Rolex watch she'd given Mark for their anniversary that he rarely wore. All of it went into her purse alongside Ethan's medication. She drove to their bank in a daze, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. The branch manager, who knew them as longtime customers, was clearly concerned by her disheveled appearance and frantic manner. "Mrs. Miller, is everything all right?" he asked as she requested an emergency withdrawal of $500,000. "Family emergency," she managed, avoiding eye contact. "I need as much cash as possible right now." The manager's expression grew troubled. "I understand, but surely you know we can't provide that amount on demand. Even with your account balances, the most we could give you immediately is around $70,000. Anything more would require advance notice for the branch to have that much cash on hand. "Then give me the 70,000, Sarah said, her desperation evident. "As quickly as possible, please." While the manager processed the withdrawal, making several phone calls for authorization, Sarah tried the kidnapper's number. As expected, it went straight to a generic voicemail. They had likely used a burner phone. 20 minutes later, she left the bank with $70,000 in an envelope, nowhere near the demanded amount. Back in her car, she received another text. Warehouse District. Building 17, Portside Industrial Park. Come through the loading dock. 1 hour. Come alone, or he dies. Sarah stared at her phone, then at the envelope of cash and bag of valuables. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough, but she had to try. Returning home, she scribbled a vague note for Mark. Following a lead about Ethan, someone in the neighborhood mentioned seeing something strange yesterday. Will call soon. Love you. It was a poor lie, but she couldn't risk telling him the truth and having him contact the FBI. She hesitated at their bedroom door, then entered and went directly to Mark's nightstand. The gun was there, a 9mm Glock they'd purchased for home protection years ago. Sarah had initially objected, but Mark had insisted they both learn to use it properly. Now she checked that it was loaded before placing it in her purse. With the cash, jewelry, and gun secured, Sarah got back in her car and entered the coordinates into her GPS. The location was an abandoned industrial area near the port, about 40 minutes from their home. As she drove, she kept checking her mirrors, paranoid about being followed by either the kidnappers or the FBI. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was a trap, that she was throwing away any chance of the authorities finding Ethan, that even if she handed over the money, the kidnappers had no reason to release him, and every reason to eliminate a witness. But rationality had no place in a mother's desperation to save her child. The Portside Industrial Park had clearly seen better days. Most of the warehouses stood abandoned, their windows boarded up or broken, graffiti marking their weathered exteriors. Building 17 sat at the far end of a cracked concrete lot, partially hidden behind overgrown vegetation that had reclaimed much of the property. Sarah parked her SUV behind the building as instructed, away from the street and any potential witnesses. The area was eerily silent except for distant port machinery and the occasional seagull. The loading dock door was partially open, raised about 3 feet from the ground, just enough for a person to duck under. She clutched her purse containing the money, jewelry, and gun, taking a deep breath before approaching the entrance. The rational part of her mind continued to scream warnings, but the image of Ethan holding today's newspaper pushed her forward. Ducking under the door, Sarah entered the cavernous warehouse interior. Most of the windows were boarded up, allowing only thin shafts of afternoon sunlight to penetrate the gloom. The space smelled of rust, mildew, and something chemical she couldn't identify. Her footsteps echoed on the concrete floor, announcing her presence to whoever waited in the shadows. "Hello," she called, her voice betraying her fear. "I'm here about my son." "Stop right there," a male voice commanded from the darkness. "Put the bag on the floor and step back 6 feet." Sarah complied, carefully placing her purse on the ground and backing away. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain they could hear it. 2 figures emerged from the shadows, both men wearing ski masks. The taller one carried a handgun casually at his side, his posture suggesting military or law enforcement training. He had a distinctive scar, visible just below his mask, crossing from his jaw to his neck. The shorter man approached the bag cautiously, keeping his own weapon trained on Sarah. "Where's my son?" Sarah demanded, fighting to keep her voice steady. The shorter man ignored her, kneeling to examine the contents of her purse. He removed the envelope of cash first, counting it quickly before scowling. "70 grand, he said incredulously, looking up at Sarah. "We asked for 500,000. "I brought jewelry too," Sarah said quickly. "Designer pieces, diamonds. They're worth more than the difference. I couldn't get more cash on such short notice." The man pulled out the jewelry, examining each piece with apparent expertise. "Maybe 200,000 total with the cash," he concluded, looking toward his partner. "Not what we agreed on." "Where is my son?" Sarah repeated, more forcefully this time. The taller man made a gesture with his hand, and a door at the far end of the warehouse opened. A third man appeared, roughly pushing a wheelchair forward. In it sat Ethan, his small frame dwarfed by the adult-sized chair that was clearly not his own. His wrists were bound to the armrests with zip ties, and tape covered his mouth, but his eyes widened at the sight of his mother. "Ethan!" Sarah instinctively moved toward him, but the taller kidnapper raised his gun, stopping her in her tracks. "This isn't how we're doing this," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "The arrangement was 500,000 for the kid. This isn't 500,000. "I'll get the rest," Sarah promised desperately. "I just need more time. Please, look at him. He needs his medication. There's a prescription in my purse. He'll have seizures without it." The three men conferred briefly in hushed tones, occasionally glancing at Sarah and Ethan. The shorter man gestured angrily at the bag of money and jewelry, while the taller one seemed to be considering options. The third man, who had brought Ethan, kept looking toward the loading dock door nervously. Finally, the taller man approached Sarah. Even with the mask obscuring his features, his cold calculation was evident in his posture. "We have a problem," he said matter-of-factly. "You've seen our faces. Well, enough of them anyway. The original plan was to release the kid and disappear before you could alert authorities. But with insufficient payment, we need additional leverage to ensure the rest of the money comes through." Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized what he was implying. "Take me instead," she blurted out. "Let Ethan go with his medication, and I'll stay as your hostage until my husband brings the rest of the money." The leader tilted his head, considering. "That's actually not a bad alternative. Your husband will certainly pay to get both of you back." He turned to the third man. "Get the kid back in the van. We're moving them to the harbor location with the others." Sarah's heart leapt at this slip of information, the harbor where the other children must be held. "No," she protested, as Ethan was wheeled away from her. "Let me give him his medication first." The leader stepped closer, his gun still at his side. "You don't make demands here. You've already failed to follow simple instructions. Now you deal with the consequences." Without warning, he raised his weapon and struck Sarah across the temple with the butt of the gun. Pain exploded through her head as she stumbled backward, a warm trickle of blood running down her face from the gash the impact had opened. Through blurred vision, she saw Ethan struggling against his restraints, his muffled cries barely audible through the tape. "Either you get in the van voluntarily," the leader said coldly, "or we drug you, and you won't be conscious to protect your son during transport. Your choice." Sarah touched her fingers to the wound on her temple, wincing at the pain. Blinking away the blood dripping into her eye, she looked at Ethan, terrified but alive, and made the only choice a mother could. "I'll come voluntarily," she said, straightening despite the dizziness. "Just please don't hurt him anymore." The leader nodded to his accomplices, who began gathering the money and jewelry. As they prepared to move toward what appeared to be a panel van parked deeper in the warehouse, Sarah fought to stay alert despite the throbbing pain in her head. She needed to remember every detail, every word, every face. If they ever got out of this alive, she would make sure these men paid for what they had done. Just as Sarah was being pushed toward the waiting van, a sound broke the tense silence, distant at first, then rapidly growing louder. The distinctive wail of police sirens, multiple units approaching from different directions. Simultaneously, the rhythmic whump-whump-whump of helicopter rotors became audible overhead, and flashing blue and red lights began to strobe through the broken windows of the warehouse. "What the hell?" The shorter kidnapper rushed to a window, peering through a gap in the boards. "Cops everywhere! Full tactical response." "You brought them?" The leader whirled on Sarah, raising his gun toward her face. "You stupid bitch, you were wired." "No," Sarah protested genuinely. "I came alone, just like you said." The third man abandoned Ethan's wheelchair, drawing his own weapon. "We need to move, now. Take the back exit to the secondary vehicle." In the chaos that followed, Sarah's maternal instinct overrode all fear. As the kidnappers shouted accusations at each other and frantically gathered their equipment, she lunged toward Ethan, desperate to reach her son before the inevitable gunfire began. The scarred leader noticed her movement and swung around, firing a shot that missed her by inches, the bullet striking a concrete pillar and sending fragments flying. Sarah didn't slow, reaching Ethan's wheelchair and frantically pulling at the zip ties binding his wrists. "Run!" she screamed at him as she freed one hand, tearing the tape from his mouth with her other hand. "Find something to hide behind." The sound of glass breaking and metal doors being forced open echoed through the warehouse as tactical teams began their entry. Sarah grabbed Ethan from the wheelchair, half carrying him toward a stack of wooden crates that might provide some cover from the coming firefight. The scarred leader appeared suddenly before them, his face contorted with rage. "You don't get to leave," he snarled, raising his weapon. Sarah instinctively turned, shielding Ethan with her body as the gun fired. The impact hit her like a sledgehammer, a white-hot bolt of pain tearing through her upper back and shoulder. The force knocked her forward, but somehow she maintained her grip on Ethan, stumbling the final few steps behind the crates before collapsing. "Mom!" Ethan's terrified voice seemed to come from far away as Sarah fought to remain conscious. She could feel warm blood soaking the back of her shirt, the pain radiating outward from the wound. "Stay down," she whispered, pushing Ethan lower behind the crates as gunfire erupted throughout the warehouse. The tactical team had made entry from multiple points, and the kidnappers were returning fire. Through increasingly blurry vision, Sarah saw the scarred leader backing toward their position, firing repeatedly at the advancing officers. SWAT team members in full tactical gear were moving methodically through the warehouse, their weapons trained on the kidnappers. One officer fell as a bullet found a gap in his body armor, but his teammates continued their advance, returning fire with precision. The scarred leader took multiple hits to his chest and abdomen, the impacts driving him backward until he collapsed just feet from where Sarah and Ethan hid. The shorter kidnapper dropped his weapon, raising his hands in surrender, while the third man attempted to reach the back exit before being tackled by two officers who crashed through a side door. As the gunfire subsided, Sarah heard a familiar voice calling her name. Mark's voice, frantic and desperate, shouting for her and Ethan. "Here," she tried to call back, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper. The blood loss was making her lightheaded, her extremities tingling with numbness. "Daddy!" Ethan screamed, his voice carrying where hers couldn't. "We're over here. Mom's hurt." Mark appeared seconds later, escorted by an officer in tactical gear. His face went pale at the sight of Sarah's blood-soaked clothing. "The bank called me," he explained as he knelt beside her, applying pressure to her wound while shouting for a medic. "They were concerned about the large withdrawal. I checked your location on the phone tracking app, then called the FBI. They mobilized within minutes once they knew where you were." Sarah tried to focus on Mark's face, but her vision kept blurring. "The others," she managed to say. "Harbor. They said—" "Harbor?" "Medic!" Mark shouted again, his hands now covered in Sarah's blood. "Stay with me, Sarah. Stay awake." Paramedics rushed over, gently moving Mark aside as they assessed Sarah's injury. They applied trauma dressings to her shoulder and established an IV line with practiced efficiency. "Gunshot wound to the upper back, through and through," one paramedic reported into his radio. "Significant blood loss, but no apparent damage to vital organs. Patient is conscious but showing signs of hypovolemic shock." As they prepared to transfer her to a backboard, Sarah reached for Ethan with her uninjured arm. "His medication," she insisted, her voice weak but determined. "In my purse, anti-seizure. He needs it now." The paramedic nodded to a colleague, who retrieved the purse from where it had been abandoned during the firefight. Inside, they found the prescription bottles Sarah had collected from home. "I'll make sure he gets it," Mark promised, holding Ethan close while maintaining visual contact with Sarah. "We're right behind you. The police will take us to the hospital right away." The paramedics carefully lifted Sarah onto the stretcher, securing straps across her body while maintaining pressure on her wound. As they wheeled her toward the waiting ambulance, she caught glimpses of the warehouse now swarming with law enforcement. The scarred leader's body lay covered with a sheet, while the other two kidnappers were being placed in separate police vehicles, their hands cuffed behind their backs. "Stay with Ethan," she whispered to Mark as the paramedics prepared to load her into the ambulance. "Don't leave him alone." "We'll be right behind you," Mark assured her, his voice breaking. "Just stay with us, Sarah. Stay strong." The ambulance doors closed, cutting off her view of Mark and Ethan standing together, surrounded by police officers. The last thing she saw was Ethan's terrified face watching as she was taken away, his small hand clutching his father's tightly. In the ambulance, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness. A paramedic monitored her vitals, while a police officer asked if she's able to answer a few questions. The paramedic objected, saying she needs rest, but Sarah managed to respond weakly. "Mrs. Miller," the officer said gently, "I know this is difficult, but if you're able to answer any questions, it could help us find the other children. Did you learn anything about where they might be being held?" Despite her pain, Sarah concentrated, remembering fragments of conversation she overheard while in the warehouse. "I heard them talking about moving the product to the harbor, and something about a warehouse." The officer immediately radioed this information to the command center. "Subject reports possible location at Harbor District, warehouse mentioned. All units redirect search efforts to harbor area." The paramedic assured Sarah the wound appears to have missed vital organs, though she'd lost considerable blood. "The bullet entered your shoulder area and exited without fragmenting, which is relatively fortunate. The trauma team will be ready for you at the hospital." "My son," Sarah whispered, fighting to stay conscious. "Your husband and son are following right behind us," the paramedic replied, adjusting her IV. "He's receiving his medication now." As they approached the hospital, the officer received radio communications and told Sarah they're acting on her information immediately, with tactical teams mobilizing toward the Harbor District. He promised to update her as soon as they knew more. At the hospital, Sarah was rushed into the emergency department. The last thing she saw before being sedated for surgery was a team of doctors and nurses preparing to operate, their faces serious but determined as they worked to save her life. Sarah awakened gradually in a hospital recovery room. As her vision cleared, she saw Mark standing with his hand on hers and Ethan still looking frightened in a new wheelchair at her bedside. Ethan immediately moved closer, carefully hugging her while avoiding her bandages. Mark looked exhausted but relieved, gently taking her hand and telling her the surgery was successful. "How's Ethan?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The hospital staff have been monitoring him closely," Mark assured her. "A pediatrician examined him and found no serious physical injuries, though he's dehydrated and emotionally traumatized. A child psychologist has already visited briefly and will return for a proper evaluation when Ethan is ready." Sarah asked about the other children, and Mark explained that they don't have all the details yet. "One of the criminals at the warehouse has been talking to authorities, apparently seeking a deal for cooperating." Mark was reluctant to leave her side for updates, so his knowledge was limited. A knock at the door revealed Detective Garcia, who entered with visible relief at seeing Sarah awake. The detective explained that based on her information about the harbor, they raided several warehouses at the Port of Miami 2 hours ago. They found the remaining 8 children and several additional suspects. All the children were alive, though some were in concerning condition due to lack of proper care and medication. They're receiving treatment at various hospitals based on their specific needs. The most shocking development, Detective Garcia continued, is that among the arrested suspects was Ms. Torres, the other female teacher from the class. She wasn't a victim, but an accomplice. Sarah was stunned. That's impossible. She's been teaching at the school for years. According to preliminary interrogations of the other suspects, Ms. Torres had accumulated substantial gambling debts with dangerous people, Detective Garcia explained. She provided inside information about the wealthy families and helped plan the entire kidnapping, including selecting the specific field trip date and location. The plan had been to collect individual ransoms from multiple families, killing children selectively to motivate payment while keeping others as leverage. Mr. Wilson, the male teacher who stayed behind, was completely uninvolved and devastated by his colleague's betrayal. Ms. Torres showed no signs of regret during questioning, Detective Garcia added. We'll be investigating with the school how they hired someone like her and how they didn't notice earlier that something was wrong with her or in her records. As Detective Garcia finished explaining, Ethan curled closer to his mother. Sarah held him protectively, knowing they faced a long recovery process. Though traumatized and wounded, she felt profound relief that her son was alive. Looking at her family, Sarah acknowledged they'll never fully return to normal after this ordeal. The trauma will persist, trust in others will be difficult to rebuild, and the grief for those who didn't survive will linger. But for now, she focused on the present moment. Her son was safe in her arms, her husband stood guard beside them, and they had survived.